The year was 1849, and London was dressed in its usual cloak of grandeur and gossip, the city pulsing with wealth and scandal. In a candle-lit chamber of the Whitmore townhouse, Lady Seraphina Whitmore sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the flames licking the marble hearth. She was only 19, her beauty compared often to a spring rose, dark hair coiled in perfect waves, skin as pale as porcelain, and eyes a striking shade of violet. Yet on this night, she did not feel beautiful. She felt bartered, stripped of choice, and silenced by the weight of her family's misfortune. Her father, Lord Whitmore, had once been a man of wealth and esteem. His ventures, bold and reckless, had drained the family coffers, and debts mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. Creditors whispered in drawing rooms, and invitations to society dwindled, every whisper, every snub pressed upon Seraphina like a brand. The Whitmores were collapsing, and her father, ever desperate, saw only one path of salvation. She was to be pawned off, married not for affection or companionship, but for fortune and survival. The name had been spoken like a decree. Damien Ravenscar, Duke of Aylesford, a man as wealthy as he was feared, a duke whose fortune was vast, whose estates sprawled across half of Kent, and whose cruelty was legend, whispered among the ton. Servants said he had a heart carved of stone, tempered by bitterness and betrayals. Widowed once, with a scandal that lingered like a ghost, Damien was known to lash out with words as sharp as blades, and punishments harsher still. Mothers warned their daughters to stay away from his gaze, yet now he was to be Seraphina's husband. "I have secured the match," her father announced, with a trembling voice, as if the words might save him from ruin. His hand gripped the armrest of his chair, his face lined with shame and stubborn pride. "The Duke of Aylesford has agreed. He shall take you as his wife, and with his dowry our debts will be cleared. You will live in comfort, Seraphina. You will restore our family's standing." Her mother wept quietly in the corner, torn between relief and despair. Seraphina, however, remained still, her heart thrumming in her chest like the beat of a war drum. She wanted to cry out, to demand why her life should be sacrificed upon the altar of her father's mistakes. But the words never left her lips. For a lady raised in obedience, taught that her worth was her dowry and her name, what choice truly remained? That evening, Seraphina found herself in her bedchamber, staring into the mirror at a reflection she hardly recognized. The gown of pale lavender made her appear fragile, a lamb led to slaughter. She imagined the Duke, this man of cruelty, this stranger who would soon hold dominion over her, standing in the doorway, cold eyes measuring her like property. A shiver ran down her spine. The next morning, the Duke's carriage arrived, black, lacquer gleaming, the Ravenscar crest carved boldly into the doors. Horses snorted in the crisp winter air as footmen opened the door with rigid precision. When Damien Ravenscar emerged, Seraphina caught her first glimpse of the man who was to be her husband. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair brushed neatly, his jaw hard and unyielding. His eyes, icy grey, swept over her with indifference, as though she were a transaction rather than a bride. "You will do," he said simply, his voice deep and cutting, sealing her fate in 3 words. Seraphina's pride burned within her chest, though her lips curved into the polite smile drilled into her since childhood. She curtsied low, whispering, "Your Grace." Inside she trembled, not from admiration but from fear. That night, lying awake beneath silk sheets, Seraphina thought of the bargain made on her behalf. She had been pawned off for a fortune, her freedom sold for gold. The fire in her heart, though quiet, vowed she would not be broken. She would endure the cruel Duke of Aylesford. She would face him with dignity, even if society had already written her story as a tale of sacrifice. And so the bargain was struck. The girl who had dreamed once of love and poetry was now bound to a man whose very name carried shadows. The world would watch, whisper, and wager. Would the fragile rose wither in the cold grasp of the cruel Duke? Or would some hidden strength change the course of both their lives? The betrothal between Lady Seraphina Whitmore and Damien Ravenscar, Duke of Aylesford, spread through society like wildfire. In the parlours of Mayfair and the smoking rooms of gentlemen's clubs, whispers turned into wagers. Some pitied Seraphina, a girl of delicate beauty traded like a coin. Others sneered that she had been fortunate to catch a duke at all, cruel or not. No one, however, believed the marriage would be one of affection. The Duke of Aylesford was infamous, and his reputation preceded him wherever he strode. On the morning of their engagement announcement, Seraphina was escorted to the Ravenscar townhouse in Grosvenor Square. Its facade, towering and severe, seemed less like a home and more like a fortress. Heavy stone columns guarded the entrance, and iron gates barred the curious from peering within. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished oak and burning coal, a scent both rich and oppressive. Damien received her in his study, a vast chamber lined with shelves of leather-bound tomes and maps of his estates. He did not rise when she entered. Instead, he regarded her with those grey, piercing eyes that made her spine stiffen. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk as though summoning not a fiancé, but a supplicant. "You will conduct yourself with dignity," Damien began without preamble. His tone was not unkind, yet it carried no warmth. It was the voice of command used to being obeyed. "You will host dinners when required, manage appearances when demanded, and bear the title of Duchess of Aylesford with decorum. I do not require affection, nor do I expect it. What I do require is loyalty and obedience. Do you understand?" The words fell like stones into her heart. Seraphina lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening on her skirts. "I understand, Your Grace." Damien studied her silently for a long moment. He was not a man of frivolous beauty, though his features were striking, a strong jaw, a straight nose, and eyes sharp enough to unnerve. Yet there was a hardness etched into every line of his face, as though joy had been chiseled away long ago. He was dressed impeccably, in black with a silver waistcoat, his posture that of a general surveying a battlefield. "You are young," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "I trust you will learn quickly. Sentimentality will not serve you. This marriage is one of necessity, and I expect you to accept that." Seraphina wanted to speak, to remind him she was flesh and blood, not merely a pawn moved upon his chessboard, but she bit back the words. She had been raised to obey, to endure. Yet something rebellious flickered in her eyes when she lifted them to his. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart thundered. For a moment, Damien's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. Then, like a shutter slamming closed, the hardness returned. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, turning his attention back to the stack of correspondence before him. She was no more than another matter of business, a line on his ledger. That evening, Seraphina dined with her parents, the contract already signed, her future sealed. Her father drank heavily, congratulating himself on the salvation of their family. Her mother avoided her eyes, wringing her hands in silence. Seraphina ate little, her stomach knotted, her mind replaying Damien's cold decrees. In her bedchamber that night, she allowed herself one fragile indulgence: tears. They slipped silently down her cheeks as she stared into the darkness. She thought of the girls she had grown up with, many already wed, some even happily. She thought of her childhood dreams, of laughter, of books read beneath sunlit windows, of love found in secret gardens. Those dreams seemed to dissolve with each tick of the clock, replaced by the looming shadow of Damien Ravenscar. And yet, beneath the sorrow, a spark of defiance stirred. If she must endure him, she would not do so meekly. She would carve out a place for herself, find her strength in a world that had stripped her of choice. If Damien was cruel, she would be steadfast. If he was cold, she would not let herself wither. The city outside slept, unaware of the quiet war beginning within the heart of a young woman bartered away. Seraphina closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I will not be broken." The cruel Duke of Aylesford might hold her fate, but he would not hold her spirit. Not yet. The bells of St. George's, Hanover Square, tolled in solemn grandeur as London gathered to witness the union of Lady Seraphina Whitmore and Damien Ravenscar, Duke of Aylesford. For society, the event was nothing less than a spectacle, an occasion to parade silks and jewels, to gossip behind feathered fans, and to feast their eyes upon the most notorious duke in England binding himself to a girl whispered to have been bartered for coin. The church glowed with candlelight, casting golden halos upon marble columns and stained glass windows. Ladies shimmered in satins of emerald, crimson, and sapphire. Gentlemen preened in tailcoats trimmed with velvet. Yet despite the brilliance, a chill lingered in the air, a chill woven of anticipation and scandal. All eyes turned when the doors opened, and Seraphina appeared on her father's arm. She was breathtaking in ivory silk, her veil a froth of lace, her dark hair gleaming beneath the crown of pearls. But though her beauty drew a collective murmur, another murmur followed swiftly after: pity. Everyone knew she had not been chosen for love. Her father's debts were spoken of in hushed tones, and the Duke's merciless character was well known. To the onlookers, Seraphina was not a bride, but a sacrifice. Her heart pounded as she walked the long aisle, each step heavy with the weight of expectation. Her father's grip on her arm was firm, almost desperate, as though he clung to salvation itself. She lifted her chin, fighting to keep her composure, refusing to let the tears that burned behind her eyes fall before this ravenous crowd. At the altar stood Damien Ravenscar, a dark figure of authority in black and silver. His face was inscrutable, his gaze coldly steady as she approached. He did not soften, did not smile, did not even reach for her hand, until the clergyman's command made it necessary. When their fingers touched, she felt no warmth, only the iron strength of a man accustomed to command. The vows echoed through the vaulted space, solemn words of devotion and fidelity, spoken by a pair who shared none. When Damien declared, "I do," his voice rang with conviction, yet it was the conviction of obligation, not affection. When Seraphina repeated the same, her voice trembled, though she cloaked the sound with dignity. The kiss that sealed their union was no kiss at all, merely the briefest brush of lips, cool and detached. Yet the assembly erupted in applause, fans fluttered, whispers surged. "The cruel Duke has his Duchess," the voices seemed to say, "and she has been bought like a prize mare." Afterward, the wedding breakfast was held at the Ravenscar townhouse, where gilded mirrors reflected tables laden with delicacies, and champagne flowed freely. But amidst the laughter and clinking glasses, Seraphina felt like a ghost wandering through her own life. Guests approached her with smiles too sharp, questions laced with condescension. "How fortunate you are, Lady Seraphina," one matron purred, her jewels winking like daggers. "To have secured the Duke's protection." "Indeed," another whispered, leaning close, "though I imagine his temper is quite formidable. But you are young, you will learn." Damien, meanwhile, moved through the crowd like a sovereign among subjects, his presence commanding respect, even fear. Yet he spared little attention for his bride, leaving her adrift among wolves. Only once did his eyes find hers across the room, and the look was unreadable, part possession, part warning. When the festivities waned and the carriage bore them to the Duke's estate, Seraphina sat in silence, the rhythmic clatter of hooves filling the void between them. Damien's profile was cut sharp against the window light, his expression as cold as the glass. "This marriage," he said at last, his voice low and deliberate, "is not a fairy tale. Do not expect tenderness, Seraphina, but know this: you will have security, wealth, and a name that commands fear. That is more than most women ever gain." Her hands tightened in her lap, nails digging into silk. "And if I had wished for love?" she asked softly, her courage surprising even herself. Damien's gaze flickered, but his answer was a single word, spoken without hesitation. "Foolish." The carriage rolled on, carrying them into a future bound not by devotion, but by duty, not by affection, but by bargain. And as Seraphina gazed into the dark horizon, she vowed silently that though she had been pawned, she would not be diminished. She might not have a marriage of love, but she would not surrender her spirit to the cruelty of the Duke. Ravenscar Abbey loomed against the twilight sky like a citadel from some ancient age. Its stone walls, weathered yet unyielding, rose high above sprawling grounds blanketed in frost. Gargoyles crouched along parapets, their grotesque faces frozen in eternal watch, while black iron gates creaked open to admit the newlyweds. For Seraphina the sight was both awe-inspiring and suffocating. It was to be her new home, this fortress of shadows where every corridor whispered of wealth and warning. The carriage rattled across the cobbled courtyard and halted before the grand entrance. Footmen hurried forward, lanterns in hand, their bows deep, but their eyes curious, assessing the young bride of their formidable master. Damien disembarked with the measured authority of a man long accustomed to command. He extended his hand for Seraphina, not with tenderness but with formality. She placed her gloved fingers lightly upon his palm, and together they ascended the wide stone steps. Inside, the abbey revealed its grandeur. Vaulted ceilings soared above, hung with crystal chandeliers whose light glimmered across polished marble floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following her with disapproval. Tapestries depicting hunts and battles draped the halls, their muted colours deepened by centuries. The silence was thick, broken only by the echo of footsteps upon stone. "This is Ravenscar," Damien said, his voice echoing in the cavernous entryway. "It is vast, and it is yours, as much as it is mine. You will find its people loyal, though they answer only to me. The East Wing will be yours. You will not enter the West Wing without my leave." The words struck her as both a gift and a warning, hers, but only by extension. His control lingered in every syllable. She inclined her head. "As you command, Your Grace." In the days that followed, Seraphina discovered the rhythm of life in the fortress. Breakfast was served precisely at 9, though Damien rarely joined her. Instead, she found herself at a long table in a cavernous dining hall surrounded by empty chairs, her solitary figure dwarfed by grandeur. Meals were conducted in silence, save for the soft clatter of silver. The Duke, when present, spoke little, his words clipped and purposeful. The household staff treated her with a mixture of deference and curiosity. Mrs. Hargrave, the housekeeper, a woman with a back as straight as a blade, explained the routines with brisk efficiency. "The Duke prefers order," she said firmly. "Punctuality, discretion. He has little patience for frivolity." The implication was clear. Serafina must adapt, or she would be crushed beneath the weight of her husband's expectations. At night, she retired alone to her chamber in the east wing, a room draped in silks of pale blue, its tall windows gazing out over frostbitten gardens. Though richly appointed, it felt like a gilded cage. She would lie awake, listening to the moan of the wind against stone walls, wondering what it meant to live not as a wife, but as a possession. The Duke did not come to her. He remained a figure of mystery, inhabiting his west wing, like a sovereign in exile. Yet cruelty was not always loud. It revealed itself in small measures, in the way Damien corrected her posture at dinner with a cold glance, in the way he silenced her attempts at conversation with a raised hand, in the way he reminded her, subtly but firmly, that she owed her life of luxury to his fortune, not her own merit. His words were never shouted, but they cut deeply, each one a reminder of her powerlessness. And still, Serafina endured. She learned the abbey's halls, wandered its gardens when weather allowed, and sought refuge in the library, a grand chamber of towering shelves and forgotten dust. Among leather-bound volumes, she found solace. There she could lose herself in poetry and histories, in the voices of those long dead who whispered courage into her soul. The Duke rarely intruded upon her sanctuary, and so the library became her kingdom, the one corner of Ravenscar where she felt free. Servants whispered of their master's past, of his late Duchess, a woman whose name was spoken with both reverence and disdain. Some said she had betrayed him, others that she had died tragically, leaving him hollow and embittered. Whatever the truth, it lingered like a shadow in every corridor, shaping Damien into the man who now held Serafina's future. One evening, as she stood upon the balcony overlooking the frozen gardens, the Duke appeared at her side. His presence startled her. He moved like a shadow, silent yet commanding. "You walk alone," he observed, his gaze fixed upon the horizon. "I find solitude preferable to whispers," she replied, her voice steady though her heart raced. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed his features, as though unused to defiance from lips so gentle. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something unreadable. "You are not as fragile as you appear." It was not a compliment, not quite. Yet Serafina felt a strange surge of strength at his words. For in that moment, she realized the truth. She might live in a fortress, but she was no prisoner of spirit. She would endure the cruelty of the Duke, not with meekness, but with quiet fire. Winter at Ravenscar Abbey was harsh, the winds tearing across the cliffs with a howl like some ancient beast. Snow blanketed the grounds in silver, muffling footsteps and cloaking the gardens in stillness. For Serafina the days passed in muted rhythm, books in the library, walks through icy corridors, dinners of silence. Yet beneath the routine, tension coiled like a spring. She felt constantly observed, judged by portraits of dukes long dead, by servants who dared not speak, and most of all by Damien himself, whose eyes missed nothing. One morning, she wandered into the stables, drawn by the scent of hay and the warmth of horses. She had always loved animals, their loyalty untainted by wealth or reputation. A chestnut mare stretched her neck toward Serafina's palm, nuzzling gently. For the first time in weeks, Serafina smiled without effort. "Careful with that one," a stable hand warned. She's spirited. Serafina laughed softly, stroking the mare's nose. So am I. But as she stepped closer, the mare startled, kicking against the stall. The sudden movement sent Serafina stumbling backward. Her foot caught on the straw and she fell hard, the mare's hooves thrashing dangerously near. Panic surged through her, her heart hammering, until strong hands seized her shoulders and pulled her clear. Damien. He had entered silently, but now he stood above her, breath quickened, his grip ironclad. For a moment, the mask of the cruel Duke slipped, replaced by raw urgency. His grey eyes were alight, not with cold disdain, but with something startlingly human, fear. You could have been killed, he snapped, his voice harsher from emotion than anger. Serafina, breathless, looked up at him. And yet I was not, thanks to you. He released her suddenly, stepping back as though burned. You must learn caution. Recklessness will not be tolerated. His words were sharp, but his tone betrayed conflict, as if he chastised himself as much as her. She rose to her feet, brushing straw from her gown. Perhaps I am not so fragile as you believe, Your Grace, she said, lifting her chin. His eyes lingered on her a moment too long before he turned away, his jaw tight. Return to the house. The stables are no place for a duchess. But that night, as Serafina lay awake in her chamber, she replayed the moment in her mind. Not his scolding, but the way his hands had trembled slightly as they pulled her to safety. For the first time, she wondered if beneath his cruel exterior something else remained, a man capable of more than coldness. The following days revealed more cracks in the armor. She noticed the way he lingered in the library doorway when he thought she was unaware, watching her as she read by the fire. She saw how the servants obeyed him not only from fear, but also from respect, their whispers less fearful than reverent. She overheard Mrs. Hargrave mutter that the Duke had once been different, warmer, even kind, before tragedy hardened him. One evening, as a storm raged against the abbey, thunder rattling the very walls, Serafina descended to the drawing room. She found Damien there, alone, a glass of brandy in his hand, firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. He did not look at her as she entered, but neither did he send her away. You fear storms? He asked suddenly, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. No, she replied truthfully, settling into a chair opposite him. I fear being silenced. His gaze flicked toward her then, sharp and searching. For a moment, she thought he might speak, confide something, perhaps even reveal the man beneath the mask. But instead, he drained his glass and stood. Go to bed, Serafina. Yet, as he passed her, his hand brushed hers, not deliberately, but enough to send a shiver racing up her arm. It was the first touch that had not felt like ownership, but something unspoken, uncertain. Serafina sat long after he left, staring into the fire. The cruel Duke was not invincible, not made solely of ice and iron. He had faltered, if only for a heartbeat, and that single heartbeat gave her hope. Hope that perhaps the fortress of Ravenscar concealed not only cruelty, but a heart still capable of warmth. Spring thawed the gardens of Ravenscar Abbey, and with it whispers began to thaw the silence surrounding Damien Ravenscar's past. Serafina, though still treated as a guest in her own life, had grown sharper in her observations. The servants, ever discreet, sometimes spoke in half-finished sentences when they thought she was out of earshot. It was enough to piece together fragments of a story, a wife who had come before her, a duchess whose name still haunted the halls like a restless ghost. The library offered clues too. One evening, Serafina found an abandoned book pressed between heavy tomes. its pages marked by a delicate ribbon of faded blue silk. On the inside cover, written in elegant feminine script, was the name Elena, the late Duchess of Aylesford. The date inscribed beneath it matched a time long before Serafina had even debuted in society. When Damien entered the library that night, she hid the book instinctively behind her skirts. He paused, noting the tension in her shoulders, but said nothing. Instead, he crossed to the window, gazing out at the storm-darkened sky. "You have questions," he said at last, his voice low. Her breath caught. "About your late wife." He did not turn. For a moment she thought he would dismiss her with his usual coldness. But then he spoke, each word deliberate, heavy as stone. "She betrayed me." The starkness of the confession startled Serafina. She dared a step closer. "How?" Finally he faced her, and for once the armor of the cruel duke seemed dented. "Elena loved another, a man I trusted, a friend I welcomed into this house. She lied, deceived, and humiliated me before the very people who looked to me for strength. When she died, suddenly, a fever, they said, I was left not with grief, but with ashes of trust, burned beyond recognition." His jaw tightened, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. "From that day, I swore never again to give my heart, never again to be made a fool." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of the fire. Serafina's own heart ached at the rawness in his tone. She had glimpsed it before in the stables, in fleeting moments of hesitation, but here it was laid bare. A man not merely cruel, but wounded. "Not all women betray," she whispered, surprising herself with the boldness of her words. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp as steel. For a moment she feared she had overstepped, but then, instead of anger, she saw something else, a flicker of uncertainty, a shadow of doubt in his own convictions. "Perhaps not," he admitted at last, "but I cannot risk it again." That night, Serafina lay awake in her chamber, the truth of his bitterness weighing heavily upon her. It did not excuse his coldness, his cutting words, or the way he wielded power like a blade, but it explained them. And in that explanation, she felt the first stirrings of something dangerous: compassion. Days later, while walking through the village that lay beneath the abbey's shadow, Serafina heard whispers of Elena from the townsfolk as well. Some pitied the late Duchess, claiming she had been starved of affection. Others muttered of scandal, of a love affair too bold to be hidden. The stories conflicted, but all pointed to one truth: Damien Ravenscar had been betrayed deeply, and in the aftermath he had chosen cruelty over vulnerability. When she returned to the abbey, Serafina found him in the study, bent over maps and ledgers. For a long moment she watched him, the firelight carving lines of weariness into his face. And she realized something she had not dared admit before. She did not see merely the cruel duke. She saw a man battling demons of grief, betrayal, and pride. Summoning her courage, she spoke softly. "Your Grace, you do not need to live in war with the past." His head lifted sharply, his eyes narrowing. "You presume much." "Perhaps," she said, her voice steady, "but if you build walls high enough to keep out pain, you also keep out every chance of joy." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then Damien stood, his shadow tall across the study wall. He approached her, each step deliberate, until he stood close enough for her to feel the weight of his presence. "You speak boldly for a duchess pawned by her family," he said, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "Perhaps boldness is all that keeps me from breaking," she replied. Their gazes locked, the fire crackling between them. For the first time, Damien did not turn away. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that left her breathless, as though he were seeing her not as a pawn, but as a woman. And though he said nothing more, Serafina knew that something had shifted. The fortress of his cruelty had cracked again, and through the fracture, a glimmer of something new began to shine. By summer the summons came, an invitation gilded with gilt edges and heavy with expectation. Lady Ashworth's midsummer ball, the most glittering event of the season, demanded their attendance. Serafina had not set foot in London since her wedding, and the thought of returning to the eyes, whispers, and judgments of society made her chest tighten. Yet Damien decreed they would go, his tone final. "The world must see us together," he said, fastening the clasp of his black cloak. "They must see that you are the Duchess of Aylesford. Whatever they whisper, they will not dare question once I make it plain." The journey to London was long, the clatter of wheels echoing through Serafina's thoughts. She gazed out the window at fields rolling into city streets, her reflection faint against the glass. This would be her test. She would not falter, not in front of those who delighted in her ruin. When they entered Lady Ashworth's ballroom, heads turned as though pulled by invisible strings. Chandeliers blazed overhead, scattering prisms of light across gilded walls and polished floors. Gowns shimmered in jewel tones, fans fluttered like restless birds, and violins sang a lilting tune. But amidst the splendor came the hiss of whispers. "There she is, the pawned bride." Poor creature, married to him of all men. "Better wealth than disgrace, I suppose." Serafina kept her chin high, her sapphire gown catching the light as though it too refused to be diminished. Damien strode beside her, dark and commanding, his very presence parting the crowd. Yet while his power silenced many, not all dared to bite their tongues. Lady Margaret Fairchild, once considered a potential duchess herself, approached with a smile too sharp to be sincere. "Your Grace," she purred, curtsying to Damien before letting her gaze sweep Serafina from head to toe. "And this must be your Duchess. How unexpected." The insult was wrapped in velvet, but its barbs were clear. Guests tittered behind jeweled hands. Serafina felt the sting, but before she could reply, Damien's voice cut through the air like steel. Unexpected, perhaps, but unrivaled. The words startled the crowd, their weight deliberate. Damien's hand slid to Serafina's waist, a gesture not merely of possession, but of defiance. Murmurs rippled outward like a tide. Lady Margaret's smile faltered, though her eyes gleamed with malice. "Of course," she said sweetly. "One can see. The Duke has developed certain tastes." It was meant to reduce Serafina, to paint her as a novelty, an ornament chosen on a whim. Laughter bubbled at the edges of the room. Serafina's throat tightened, but then Damien turned, his voice rising above the din. Enough. The violins faltered, conversations hushed, all eyes fixed on the Duke of Aylesford, who now stood as though before a tribunal of peers. "You will not speak of my Duchess with such contempt," Damien declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. "She is not a pawn. She is the strength this title requires, the dignity this house demands. Any who insult her insult me, and I do not forgive easily." The silence that followed was electric. No one dared breathe, let alone laugh. Serafina felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Never before had Damien defended her so openly, so fiercely. His words were more than protection, they were a claim. Then, in a move that stunned even her, he bent his head and pressed his lips to her gloved hand. The gesture, so public and deliberate, drew a collective gasp. Some ladies swooned, others glared, but none could deny what they had seen. The The cruel duke had bowed, if only slightly, before his duchess. For the rest of the evening, no one dared mock her. They watched instead, whispering in awe and disbelief, as Damien led her into the dance. His hand at her back was firm, his steps precise, his eyes never leaving hers. To the crowd they appeared the perfect couple, unshakable, untouchable. Yet as the waltz carried them across the floor, Serafina's mind whirled. Was this defense merely performance, another weapon in Damien's arsenal of control? Or had something deeper cracked within him, enough to let truth slip through? When the final notes faded, he leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "They will not touch you now," he murmured. Her heart pounded. "And what of you, your grace? Will you still keep me at arm's length?" He did not answer, but the shadow in his eyes betrayed a war within himself. As they departed the ballroom under 1,000 stares, Serafina knew that society's opinion had shifted. No longer was she the pitied pawn. She was the Duchess of Aylesford, claimed publicly by her cruel yet enigmatic husband. And though the world saw strength, only she had glimpsed the truth. Damien Ravenscar was no longer unbreakable. The carriage ride back to Ravenscar Abbey was cloaked in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves striking cobblestones. Serafina sat rigid, her gloved hands clasped in her lap, her mind replaying every word Damien had spoken at the ball. His defense had been fierce, his kiss upon her hand undeniable. To all of London it had looked like devotion. But she could not silence the question burning within her. Was it real, or merely another display of power? At last she spoke. "Why did you do it?" Damien's gaze remained fixed on the darkened streets beyond the window. "Because they sought to humiliate you, and I will not have my name tarnished by their mockery." The words stung, colder than the night air seeping through the cracks in the carriage door. Yet beneath the frost she sensed hesitation, as though another truth hovered unsaid. She turned away, refusing to let disappointment break her composure. In the days that followed, Serafina felt the strain of two battles, the external one of society's judgment, now quelled, and the internal one within her marriage. Damien no longer wielded cruelty with the same sharpness, but neither did he offer warmth. He existed in some liminal space between distance and desire, his eyes betraying what his words never admitted. One evening, restless, Serafina returned to the library. The blue-ribboned book lay upon the table where she had hidden it weeks before. She opened it again, tracing Elena's handwriting, imagining the woman who had preceded her. Did Elena once sit here, dreaming of freedom? Did she love, even if not her husband? You read her words again. The voice startled her. Damien stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He entered slowly, the firelight sharpening the planes of his face. "I want to understand," Serafina admitted, her voice steady. "To understand what turned you into the man you are." He stopped across from her, his hands clasped behind his back. "And if you do? Then perhaps I will know whether to fear you or forgive you." The air thickened between them. For once, Damien did not cloak himself in silence. He lowered himself into a chair, his posture no longer the rigid stance of command, but something wearier, more human. "Elena's betrayal shattered me," he said. "I built this fortress, these walls, to keep myself from feeling again. Cruelty was armor, control was survival. If I kept the world beneath my heel, it could not wound me." Serafina listened, her heart tightening. "But in shielding yourself, you became the very thing you despised. You wounded others instead." His eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time they did not blaze with defense. Instead, they softened, shadows of regret lurking there. Yes. The admission was simple, but it cracked the silence like thunder. Damien Ravenscar, the feared, the cruel, the unyielding, had spoken a word of concession. "You deserve better than what I have been," he added, voice raw. The words lingered in the library air, heavy and dangerous. Serafina felt her throat tighten, her chest ache. She had longed for some acknowledgement, some spark of remorse, and here it was, quiet, uncertain, but real. Rising from her chair, she crossed to the fire where he sat. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and touched his hand. It was a daring gesture, one that risked rejection. But Damien did not pull away. His fingers curled slightly around hers, tentative, as though relearning how to hold something fragile. "You do not need to remain in chains of your own making," she whispered. "Cruelty is not your destiny. You can choose another path." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a shuddering breath, he whispered, "I do not know if I remember how." "Then let me remind you," she said, her voice fierce with quiet conviction. Their eyes locked, and in that gaze lay the possibility of redemption, not the certainty, not yet, but the fragile hope of it. For the first time since their marriage, Damien Ravenscar allowed himself to believe that the woman beside him was not a pawn forced into his world, but perhaps the key to breaking the chains he had bound around his heart. Autumn came to Ravenscar Abbey in a blaze of gold and crimson, the trees along the cliffs bowing in fiery surrender to the coming winter. The abbey, once a fortress of stone and silence, had begun to feel different to Serafina. The halls no longer pressed against her with suffocating weight. The servants' faces had softened, and whispers no longer carried fear, but quiet respect. Something was changing, not just within the walls, but within the man who ruled them. Damien had grown quieter in his cruelty, gentler in his presence. He no longer barked orders without thought, nor did he wield silence as a blade. Instead, he lingered at her side during walks in the gardens, asking questions in halting tones about her childhood, her favorite books, her dreams. Each answer seemed to chip away at the armor he had worn for so long. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Serafina wandered to the cliff's edge where the sea crashed below. The wind whipped her hair free from its pins, and she closed her eyes, savoring the salt-laced air. She heard footsteps behind her, steady and purposeful. "You should not stand so close," Damien said, his voice carrying both concern and command. She turned to face him, a wry smile tugging her lips. "Will you forbid me from the very air, Your Grace?" His lips twitched, almost a smile, but then his gaze darkened with something deeper. "No, not forbid, protect." The word hung between them, heavier than any decree. Protect, not own, not control. For the first time, Damien's tone carried vulnerability, as though he feared losing her to the sea, to the world, to fate itself. "Serafina," he began, her name spoken not as a title, but as something sacred. "From the day you entered these halls, I saw you as a pawn, a duty, a shield against society's ridicule. I cloaked myself in cruelty to keep you and myself at a distance. But I can no longer pretend." Her breath caught, her heart racing. "I was broken," he continued, his voice unsteady. "Betrayed, humiliated, turned to stone by grief, but you—" He faltered, then sank suddenly to his knees before her, the feared Duke of Aylesford bowing in humility. Gasps echoed from the terrace where servants had gathered unnoticed, drawn by the charged air of the moment. "You have undone me," Damien whispered, his grey eyes lifted to hers, unguarded at last. "You have given me back what I thought forever lost." "My heart is yours, if you will have it." The sight nearly stole the air from her lungs. This man, this cruel duke who had once seemed carved from ice, was on his knees, not in command but in surrender. Her eyes burned with tears she could not contain. "Damien," she said softly, her voice breaking. She bent, taking his hands in hers. "I did not ask for this fate. I feared it, hated it. But somewhere along the way I saw the man beneath the cruelty. I saw a heart scarred but still beating. And now I see the man I could love." His hands tightened around hers, his shoulders shaking as though years of silence and pride had collapsed in that single moment. Rising, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were both salvation and absolution. She felt the strength of him, yes, but also the trembling of a man who had finally let go of his chains. The kiss that followed was not born of duty or power, but of pure, unguarded love. It was fierce, desperate, tender, a promise sealed not by circumstance, but by choice. When they parted, their foreheads pressed together, Damien's voice was low and steady. "No more cruelty, no more walls, only us." Serafina smiled through her tears, her heart swelling, with a peace she had not thought possible. "Only us." Word of the Duke's transformation spread quickly, carried by servants, whispered in villages, and eventually reaching London's drawing rooms. The cruel Duke of Aylesford, once feared and despised, was now spoken of with awe. And at his side, the Duchess once pitied as a pawn now shone as his equal, her dignity and compassion elevating them both. Ravenscar Abbey no longer felt like a fortress, it was a home, and within it, Serafina and Damien stood side by side, not bound by bargains or fear, but united by love hard won and fiercely kept.